So after this emotional intensity of Blanche's entry, we have finally the interaction between her, Eunice, and characters that represent New Orleans. Immediately, we have this stage direction, finally, which suggests that Eunice is in some way reluctant to address Blanche, probably because she's picked up on the social cues that are embodied in her costume, and her clothing, that she's from a different part of town, she's from the other side of the tracks, and that therefore she has no business speaking to her. But she begins purely to try and be helpful. What's the matter, honey? Are you lost? And again, here, that fish out of water trope that we've got here of Blanche not belonging in these surroundings is echoed again, alluded to by Williams's dialogue here. And his direction of Blanche is again increasingly intensely revealing of her emotional state. She responds with faintly hysterical humour. She's got this kind of out of breath, kind of flustered sense of exasperation. She's so confused and baffled by her surroundings that she's hysterical. She's at the point where her control could be lost. And this is where she gives us this metaphorical summation of her plot. She says, they told me to take a streetcar named Desire and then transfer to one called Cemeteries and ride 6 blocks and get off at Elysian Fields. Now we've got this plot here, the mapping out of her fate in this narrative trajectory. They told me to take a streetcar named Desire. We see each of these, the streetcar itself and the locations, as the metaphorical representation of her fate. In tragic terms, or arguably tragic terms, she is compelled by a force beyond her control, which is namely, physical desire, which connects to the central plot line that connects to her and Stanley, but also forms the backdrop of her, the degradation that has caused the trauma in her life that has brought her to this point. As we find out later on, she has been sleeping with soldiers at Laurel in order to evade the reality and the horror of her life. So she is compelled by bodily desire. But it's led her to a place called Cemeteries. It's led her to a kind of death of sorts. But then there is this suggestion of the culminating journey being in Elysian Fields, and that, as we see throughout the story, Williams does sympathise with Blanche. He doesn't celebrate her as a sort of archetypally heroic tragic hero, but he sympathises with her battle with the rugged, cold materialism of the 20th century. A little further down, Eunice says, in this dialogue, that's where you are now, at Elysian Fields. This here is Elysian Fields. They mustn't have understood what number I wanted, what number you're looking for. This dialogue, again, suggests disbelief and her refusal to approach reality, which is a consistent theme throughout the play of Blanche's attempts to evade reality. And we can see it in these early incipient moments in the play, that she absolutely cannot bear to confront the reality of the situation, and keeps attempting to formulate alternatives, and is convincing herself that, the circumstances with which she's been presented are not reality. This stage direction here is key. She wearily refers to the slip of paper. We're 3 pages into the play, and already she's weary, which I think is an early sign of her fragility and degradation in the face of this dynamic, changing, diverse, materialistic, kind of rampant industrial America that is embodied in the city of New Orleans. She's grown weary already just from her streetcar journey and attempting to find her way to their apartment. So there's again this early sign of her fragility in the face of this. Again, uncomprehendingly, she responds. The stage direction again is revealing of her inner turmoil, that she is completely distanced from reality. She cannot approach the subject of the context that she finds herself in. And so she just simply changes the terms. I'm looking for my sister, Stella Dubois. And, there's something important being suggested by shifting from, I'm looking for an address, to I'm just simply looking for a human. she can't actually bear the reality of admitting that the address is where her sister lives, so she kind of detaches that from their dialogue. We're no longer talking about the address, we're now talking about the human. Who am I looking for? Well, Stella Dubois, I mean Mrs. Stanley Kowalski, so she can't even actually come to terms with her changing name. And it's, the names in this are important, that we've got this sort of antique French name that suggests the kind of colonial French nobility that this family are related to, and then a Polish name, that represents the migrants that would fill America and drive their industrial expansion in the 20th century. And Stanley being the representative of that. So we're seeing this kind of clash on the level of names, and this name that Blanche actually has to remind herself to use. Eunice said, "That's the party. You just did miss her, though. Can this be her home?" These dashes that litter her lines in this dialogue show again that disbelief. Eunice says she's got the downstairs here and I got the up. Oh, she's out. Again, there's this sense of fear because Stella's not there, and actually I think a sense of disappointment at her failure to abide by the codes of chivalry and politeness that we would associate with this kind of southern nobility that Blanche embodies. You notice the bowling alley around the corner of Blanche again. I'm not sure I did. There's again the sense that there's a huge subtext underneath these lines of, well, why the hell would I notice a bowling alley? The fact that this lady seems to think that it's fit for conversation. Eunice mentions it. Blanche is almost stunned by it, as if I would find myself in a bowling alley. So she does manage here to correct herself and to be relatively polite in this particular context, which is something that we find as we go through the scene disappears from her control. She can't retain that sense of politeness because her snobbery and her condescending kind of socioeconomic position gets the better of her. Well, that's where she's at, watching her husband bowl. There's a pause. You want to leave your suitcase here and go find her? No. This bluntness that litters the progression of her dialogue in the scene. We see further here, she's just curt and rude. This lady's trying to be extremely helpful, and she can't abide the thought of going in a bowling alley and leaving her suitcase here. No, it's not valise, her suitcase here. I'll go tell her you can't. Thanks. And what we have in this scene, I think, is this sudden slip into the dynamic of the black lady helping the noble white woman. And Blanche is, immediately comfortable with this, that the Negro woman becomes the kind of the help. And Blanche seems quite comforted by this. This is her first authentic expression of gratitude. And it's not so much for the favour that this woman is doing her, but I think the social hierarchy that this favour represents and her greater familiarity with it. Further down, Eunice says, well, why don't you just go in and make yourself at home till they get back? How could I do that, Blanche says. So, obviously, the phrase make yourself at home is deeply ironic when we've been given this kind of fish out of water motif by Williams in these opening sections of the text. We see that she is completely anything but at home in these surroundings. But Eunice, cuts through this and just assumes that she's like anyone else and could be comfortable in these surroundings. And then Blanche, again, her dashes reveal this kind of subtext, this subtext that's unspoken underneath these lines, that she's both shocked by the lack of control over the apartment. She can't believe that someone else would actually let someone into their apartment. So there's a sort of sense of stunned disbelief at the intermingling of families and of property here. And that actually also it's impossible for her to be comfortable in these surroundings. So there's this a nuance to that restrained dialogue that Williams creates with the dashes, where Blanche's feelings are twofold and form the subtext of that line. And Eunice clearly, communicates how this would be happening and interprets Blanche's lines literally and practically. We own this place, so I can let you in. And there's a real difference, I think, being constructed in this dialogue between Eunice and Blanche of Eunice's kind of humanistic, practical realism. She's trying to be friendly, she's trying to be nice, she's She doesn't actually interpret the subtext of Blanche's comments at this point, but as we see as we go through, Blanche gets ruder and ruder, and it becomes impossible to ignore. So she gets up and opens the downstairs door. A light goes on behind the blind, turning it light blue. Again, we've got this colour. We've got this blueness that seems to be outside, penetrating and infiltrating to the internal scene, into the apartment. Blanche slowly follows her into the downstairs flat. The surrounding areas dim out as the interior is lighted. 2 rooms can be seen, not too clearly defined. The one first entered is primarily a kitchen, but contains a folding bed to be used by Blanche. Now, the previous dialogue carries this huge sense of, well, this subtext of socioeconomic distinction. Blanche sees herself in some way as different to these people that surround her here and distinctive in terms of her class superiority. Not only is she humbled by these surroundings, this is a simple 2-room flat, but the place where she is going to stay, this a folding bed used by Blanche, is vulnerable to the outside, the immediate context of the rest of the apartment, and the apartment itself is vulnerable to the surroundings. So there's a sense here of distinctions collapsing in the stage setting, and that collapsing of distinction is precisely what drives Blanche's internal conflict, that her life no longer can remain distinct from those that surround her and that she sees as being beneath her. Eunice here, this is the first time she picks up on Blanche's kind of snobbery. She defensively, noticing Blanche's look, says, "It's sort of messed up right now, but when it's clean, it's real sweet." She's detected her hostility and her sense of being stunned at the surroundings. Blanche just says, "Is it?" Again, this is a loaded question that's blunt and hostile. And he says, I think so. So you're Stella's sister. Here, I think that question contains the sense of surprise that Eunice expresses here. She cannot believe, actually, that these two are related, in spite of supposedly the obvious connections between them, that are commented on when we meet Stella. It makes it relatively clear that Stella is from a superior social background, historically, compared to the people that she surrounds herself with. And we see that in those opening directions where she interacts with Stanley. We can see clearly that she's superior, but it's this rudeness that Eunice is obviously detecting and is stunned that they're actually related. This reveals that Stella is much more at ease in these surroundings. Now, this is where Blanche's rudeness increases in intensity. She says yes, and then stage direction, wanting to get rid of her. "Thanks for letting me in." I think also there is a sense of snobbery in here, of superiority and condescension, obviously. But there's also a sense of fear and fragility here, that she just needs to be on her own because she's frightened of the surroundings. She needs some space to kind of relax and be herself. So there's a sense of vulnerability always behind Blanche's sort of assertive, unpleasant moments. "Por nada," as the Mexicans say, "por nada. Stella spoke of you." "Yes," and this is suddenly where she perks up. Eunice says, "I think she said you taught school." "Yes." "And you're from Mississippi, huh?" "Yes." There's this, I think she's waiting for a compliment in this dialogue, and that when she finds that one is not forthcoming, she's blunt and dismissive. And I think perhaps also this sort of blunt responses suggest perhaps a sense of discomfort with the past and the skeletons in her closet, so to speak, that we end up encountering later on in the play. Eunice explains that she showed me a picture of your home place, the plantation, Belle Reve, and of course the name of this place means beautiful dream. A great big place with white columns. Yes, and this ellipse that's used here is wistful. It carries a sense of longing and a sense of attachment to this location and the social structure that it embodies and the set of values that we associate with it. Says a place like that must be awful hard to keep up. Again, there's a sort of naivety about Eunice's dialogue here, because what it obviously misunderstands is that these people don't look after the place themselves. They have help to do it. They have housekeepers and slaves historically to do this for them. Blanche says, if you'll excuse me, I'm just about to drop. Eunice says, sure, honey, why don't you sit down? What I meant was I'd like to be left alone. So she has a little go at being polite. She has a go at, staying true to her southern values of being chivalrous and polite. But this hostile response, she makes explicit. She's not happy with Eunice's response. She wants her to understand it more clearly. So this, I think, prefigures her attempt at maintaining her honour that is embodied in the location of Belle Reve and her reputation of nobility, and that this crass rudeness that she demonstrates towards Eunice is a way of, I think, preserving that sense of honour. Eunice is offended. She picks up on this kind of hostility. And she says, I make myself scarce in that case. But I didn't mean to be rude, but I'll drop by the bowling alley and hustle her up. So she's still friendly and pleasant to her. But what we see here is this early sign of her hostility and her snobbishness and her sense of superiority. And Williams is doing this, and he carries on doing this throughout the first scene, is distancing us from Blanche, And this figures in the play's overall tragedy, is that Williams sympathises with Blanche's tragic fate, and he sympathises with the plight of, an individual who represents absolute moral values and a sense of nobility and a sense of aesthetic beauty, and the plight of those individuals confronting a reality that is cold and clinical and rampant and kind of primitive in its lack of aesthetic understanding. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is a supporter of the values that someone like Blanche represents, and that I think the distancing between the audience and Blanche in this opening scene, I think, creates that sense of moral ambiguity that we don't necessarily, even though we sympathise with her confrontation with a sort of rugged realism that overwhelms her, we don't necessarily at the same time sympathise with her attachment to, a form of social oppression, effectively, that is at the core of her value system. So this moral ambiguity, I think, is important in creating a sense of tragedy that Williams is looking for. That these orthodoxies of the past are sort of ideals that are doomed to be destroyed because they are compelled towards the things that precipitate their destruction, and that's the nature of the tragedy. That something beautiful and aesthetic and noble is inherently attracted to the values and the social forces that bring about its destruction. There's a sort of helplessness about that. Once she's left alone, Blanche sits in a chair very stiffly with her shoulders slightly hunched and her legs pressed close together and her hands tightly clutching her purse as if she were quite cold. Now we know she's not cold, she's in New Orleans, it's hot and humid. There's a sense of horror and fear and discomfort in these surroundings. And I think possibly she's also kind of reminded of trauma by Eunice. There's this dialogue above that forces her to reflect on the past, has brought about the reflections on the degradation that she subjected herself to in her past. And that recollection combined with these kind of, what she sees as vile, kind of scummy surroundings, is being communicated here through her body language. She sits very stiffly with her shoulders hunched and her legs pressed close together and her hands tightly clutching her purse. She's bound up. Her body language is the body language of someone in desperate fear, almost someone kind of sat on a chair, with a sea of, sharks underneath them that are going to bite them. She's poised in a fearful kind of posture that demonstrates that she is completely at odds with this context and these surroundings. After a while, the blind look goes out of her eyes and she begins to look slowly around. A cat screeches. So there's this immediate moment of a sort of incipient connection with reality, and then this violent sound in her mind, this violent sound causes her a sudden kind of startled shock at the moment where she connects with reality. So this creates this sense of her idiosyncrasy, how she is out of place in this set. And the sound that Williams uses is a real key feature of the play itself, and features with the stage directions as a kind of running commentary on the mental state of Blanche particularly. Suddenly she notices something in a half-open closet. She springs up and crosses to it and removes a whiskey bottle. She pours a half tumbler of whiskey and tosses it down. Now, bearing in mind what we've just said about her kind of terrified posture, she quickly forgets about it on the sight of alcohol and springs up. She's immediately forgotten about all this because she knows she's located something that will allow her to forget about her problems and to evade reality once again. She is someone who evades the real. She cannot bear to confront it. And alcohol becomes a problem for her because, she wants to escape reality. And the vitality of the verbs that Williams uses, it springs and tosses it down, I think suggests, her alcoholism and her desire for escape, the escapism that she's seeking. She carefully replaces the bottle and washes out the tumbler at the sink. Then she resumes her seat in front of the table. Now again, in terms of distancing herself, in terms of Williams distancing us, the audience, from her, he shows her here that she's manufacturing a kind of guise, a layer of reality that's deceptive. She's drank a load of whiskey and is trying to replace all of the objects and the items so that no one notices. So immediately we've got someone who can't face reality and actually manipulates what other people see, and is deceptive, both of herself and of others. So we've got, someone that's rude and deceptive and an alcoholic here. And so this overall distancing of the audience from Blanche is quite an important feature of the scene. She says faintly to herself, "I've got to keep a hold of myself." So this reveals to us that the tension that's being described in this stage, in this extensive lyrical stage direction, is one of the disintegration of her identity. That herself in this context is threatening to be kind of torn asunder, and that she has to fight to retain that sense of identity and integrity.